Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by Afgreen, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK and Sendex. There are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocer, and the other that heat comes from the furnace.
Good day, this is Nation in Conversation. I'm Theo Foster. Nation in Conversation is your partner in dialogue. We share knowledge and insight. We welcome you to today's conversation. The vast majority of food sold in South Africa are sold by a handful of large retail chains. What is the impact of this on the consumer, on the food value chain, and on the producers? You can follow us on Twitter @NationConverse or visit the website nationinconversation.co.za. Joining me in the studio today, Kobus Pinaar, Technical Manager, Farming for the Future at Woolworths, and Professor Johan Kirsten, Head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Pretoria. Johan, I want to start with you. The fact that our food value chain is dominated on the retail side by a few very large retail chains. What is the impact on that on the value chain?
Maybe just to confirm the issue of large retail chains dominating the food system is obviously a concern to many people. You know, has it an impact on your suppliers? Because the suppliers are not only farmers, but they're also manufacturers and other input suppliers. So really the question that many people on the left of the spectrum would ask is this conducive for social cohesion? Is the large concentration providing us with cheaper food, the best food? And is that process and the competition between the large retailers providing additional pressure on the suppliers and the producers, which is the question that you've asked? Obviously now we need to understand that margins are a key issue for retailers, but also volume. And as Kobus will probably confirm, is that the retail business is a volume business. And sometimes the margin is small, but therefore you need to have turnover. And to have turnover, you need to have substantive supply and a good supply of product. And therefore you have to line up larger processes. At the end of the day, that has an impact on the entry ability of smaller suppliers. It's very difficult for small companies to supply to the large retailers because you are sometimes required to supply all of them. So when we look at the food system broadly, you need to understand the impact on entry barriers, you need to understand the impact on pricing, but you also need to understand the impact on the profitability of suppliers to the retail system. So these are all questions that one can probably debate with many of the suppliers to the retailers, but that's sort of the broad spectrum of issues.
From your side, Kobus, you're one of the major players in the retail side of the market, but your market is not as sensitive on the pure price mechanism as some of the other market segments. In terms of the demands that you would place on the supply chain and in effect the producer, what are those demands?
Yes, our consumer or our client is definitely driving demands that goes through to the producer. And as the professor rightly says, it's not only the farmer, but there's also processing plants and factories in between. And demands definitely safety and the healthiness of our food. So do I eat healthy food? Am I not going to get sick? That's one of the major ones. And then the traceability of food. Whenever there's a problem, they need to feel comfortable that we know where the food comes from and to identify exactly where the problem may have occurred and fix it. That's what they demand. They also demand that we handle our suppliers in an ethical way. So the ethical sourcing of food is critical to them, to know that we are looking well after the workers in the factories and on farms, and also on the environment, the impact on the environment. many questions has been asked by our consumers about the impact of food on the environment and what are we as a retailer doing around that to ensure that the impact on the environment is as less as possible.
Maybe if one can explore it a bit with Kobus and ask about the volume. Is there not a volume demand that you would put on your suppliers in terms that you have to supply all the chain, all the stores in your particular chain, and that has a particular requirement for you to be a listed supplier?
Woolies is in this position that we're not in the volume game. We're one of the smaller retailers, one of the bigger ones. And it's more about quality. Quality is the Woolworths ethos. People shop at Woolworths because they go for the quality. So, and as we all know, the higher the quality, you usually the less the volume. So, and vice versa. So, what we do is we have a negotiation way with our suppliers before the season starts, where we negotiate with them a certain grow program. So they get the estimate from us for the season. In vegetables, for example, it will be 6 months. In fruit, it will obviously be a year, to decide that this is the volume you're going to deliver in each week. And we negotiate that with them. But the main focus is you cannot do too much volume and sacrifice quality. So quality is our drive.
Johan, in terms of the negotiation between the producer and the retail store, where does that leave the market, the free market, the price discovery, the fresh produce market, and where would those powers to negotiate margins, where is that clarified?
I was just going to say the issue is power here. Who has the power? And obviously, in the retail store and the retail chain has a certain reputation to uphold, as in terms of in this case Woolworths with quality and as a particular reputation. So the negotiating power is from that angle, and also because they reward the farmers much better, there's always the power is on their side. And the requirements of many of the other retailers are in such a way that if you don't get listed there, you're actually losing out on big market play and a market opportunity. So you almost as a supplier, a farmer, or a manufacturer, you're always at the losing end if you're not. That's why I asked the question about volume. If you're not able to supply the total spectrum that they're requiring, whether it's quality, whether it's volume, whether it's a specific topic. So I think the price discovery issue is sometimes very tricky. But when I investigated these things about 10 years ago with the Food Price Commission, the common comment from the retailers was that they are only providing the facility where you retail. The price determination is done by you as a supplier, but we require rebates, we require you to pay for shelf space, we require you to pay for listing fees. So all of these things are additional revenue for the retail chain, but it is not the pricing that is happening. But sometimes the retailer will play off suppliers against one another, say this one is a bit cheaper than that one, should you not drop your price? So the issue of pricing is subdued, but there's no negotiator on price. The suppliers sometimes pass through the price, but the retailers could be sensitive about that price. But in his case, it's a bit different. I think there's a...
We will come back in terms of the underlying dynamics and also specifically the consumer demand. I would like to explore that further. Nation in Conversation will be back right after the break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. We talk about the relationship between retailers, producers, and the clients of the retailers. Johan, price discovery. Where does the fresh produce markets fit into the price discovery situation, specifically where retail chains contract directly with the underlying farmers?
It's an interesting dilemma because in the old days, the fresh produce market was the main source of fresh produce. But many of the retailers have either directly contracted with farmers where packaging and labeling takes place on the farm, or they have packing houses or distribution centers where the top quality fruit and vegetables are delivered. But the uncertainty is where is that price determined, and sometimes people argue that the price at the fresh produce market is taken as the benchmark, and that is then and then a premium is paid on top of that for the quality or for the volume and for the consistency that you provide to the retailer.
Do we have effective and efficient, cost-effective value chains in terms of the producer up to the market space?
There's obviously counter arguments, but I think the fundamental argument is, given that it's volume business, obviously the cost of transport and the cost of movement of product and the cost of retailing is per unit much lower than one would normally have. So my interpretation is that it would be relatively cost efficient, but we have not understood fully the waste in the chain. I think there's lots of waste, not only in transport, theft. I think if you talk to retailers about theft in stores, it's huge. And then obviously losses within the store in terms of temperatures of the fridges that are not regulated properly. So the broader efficiency in terms of unit cost and transport and volume business are probably fine, but then we have not have a clear understanding of those other dimensions that could impact negatively on the bottom line of retailers.
When you talk prices with farmers, to what extent do you take the view of the consumer into consideration? Because I think from your point of view, your consumer does not only make a decision on price, it makes a decision on a variety of aspects. In terms of that negotiations with a farmer, how does that work? How does that take place? And where does the consumer fit into that?
Yes, we're in a privileged position that price is one of the issues, not the only issue, but there's a ceiling. You can't go too high with your prices, otherwise people definitely not shop at Woolworths. And usually we see it when interest rates goes high, our sales do drop. It's because then people feel it in their pocket. Obviously demand, supply and the fresh produce side is one of the key factors. The fresh produce market and our competition's prices obviously at the end plays a role in how we determine prices with our suppliers. But again, is that the quality and the difference is what we're driving. So when we do have our flavor burst range on nectarines and stone fruit, they are at a much higher price than sometimes 15–20% higher, and consumers do purchase them because it's value. So it's a question of what is the value of that product. And what is behind that product?
What is behind the product?
What's behind that product?
That story behind the product.
Yeah.
To what extent is the consumer demanding that?
Every year, every day, by the minute, more and more. They want to know what are we doing behind the product? Are we looking after the people? It's about the planet, it's about the people. And obviously, if we cannot prove that or show it to them, they will start asking questions to Woolworths because they trust the brand that we are doing all of those things with our suppliers. And they want to see more approach of having a JV or a relationship with the suppliers than rather having us telling them what to do.
That places additional pressure on the supplier. Is the supplier geared towards that?
Obviously, many suppliers now have to comply with auditing. As you've mentioned in a private conversation, auditing takes a very big chunk of the cost of the chain because you have to now commit to all the claims you are making in terms of labor practices and environmental practices. So that puts a pressure on the producer, but it also puts a pressure on the chain as such. So auditing fees tend to be a big issue in the commercial value chains itself. But also I think the issue of the story is not only about ethics and environment, the story is about also emotion and about culture. And I think there are many South African local products that can actually also present a very nice story to the retail customer. It's sometimes sad to see that many of the retailers don't believe in our own things, which is a very nice story that can actually add to the ethics.
What are you referring to specifically?
We can think about our rooibos, which is probably very well stocked in many of the retailers, but Karoo lamb, for example, the waterblommetjies, there are a whole range of South African products that are presenting very nice stories that can add the additional value and proudness and South African pride to the issue. But again, auditing requirements puts pressure on not only the retailer, but on the producer and the agents in between.
What should the role of the government be in this chain?
It's a big issue because many of these claims that you make is regulated under the Consumer Protection Act, also under Agricultural Product Standards Act, and the regulations are put in place to serve those things. But often the cost of doing that implementation is provided to the role players in the chain, and the government is not taking responsibility for that, and the actions are not taken. Many other governments in other parts of the world, they take responsibility of auditing and costing and everything. So that is in my mind, the enforcement process of regulations are very important to bring order in the chain. Government also has a role to play in terms of the competition system, whether the questions could be asked whether the producers, specifically manufacturers and the retailers, are too large, and whether there's uncompetitive dimensions. But the reality is also so that many of the retailers compete on price, and the competition is fierce. So the practices are sometimes not well understood. But just to make the point, regulation, competition elements are the key roles of government in our food value chain.
When we get back, I want to look at the future and the future trends. Nation in Conversation will be back just after the break. Welcome back. This is Nation in Conversation. Kobus, before the break, Johan talked about the role of the government. In terms of, from your point of view, what should the role of the government be, and what's the role of audits from a Woolworths point of view?
In current status in South Africa is that every retailer is pretty much writing their own standard. And there is, the legislation is there. But I think the consumer wants more than just minimal conformation to the legislation. I think that the government can play a critical role, and they can play a bigger role in making sure that there's one standard in South Africa. Because I think as a consumer myself, I will sometimes get confused about all these standards that's floating around from one retailer to the next, or one institution to the next. So I think if they can, we've got some of the most fantastic legislation, but the enforcement of that is sometimes vague, and I think they can play a bigger role in that.
Role of audit specifically on your side?
Yes, I quite like the USDA approach where they take charge of what's going on. And they set the benchmark there, and so it will phase out this situation which Professor listed, that you need to list to have a certain standard. If government can put our producers at a certain level, it will make our life in retail much easier. We can then pick and choose, they're already there. But at this case, they're pretty much absent in making sure that the standards is enforced, and enforced in such a way that we have growth. It mustn't be a way where you take out the stick.
Enabling environment.
Yeah, it mustn't be an enabling environment, yes.
I think because of the lack of government enforcement and the fact that there are other things that is important for retailers, they've introduced their private standards. So there's a proliferation of private standards across all the retail chains. And therefore, the consumer is likely to be confused. What is the true value of this product that is on the shelf? And obviously there are ranking orders in terms of the standards of the various retailers, and people believe in certain ones more than others because they know the auditing process is very good, and the experience of consuming the product has been consistent. I think that is something very important. And these private standards also play a very important role in trying to attract clients to your store, because the competition for clients is the big issue for many retailers.
If we look at the current situation and we look at the relationship between the consumer of the retailer and the producer, to what extent do you see this change or manifest itself in the future?
So many dimensions. I think we can have almost a separate program just on that. The main thing is that consumers want to connect more with the producer, because the food product on the shelf has lost identity, and therefore you've seen people just buying food and eating food, but now that additional aspirational thing about connection and experience are things that consumers want to experience. So although you need to have middlemen, you also need to have a connection between the consumer and the producer, and that can be happening through cloud technology, the IT systems that we have in place. So those are the trends that are going to happen in the future, and that will require more investment by retailers in smart technology and smart scanning technology and being able to connect with the producer with a photograph or whatever. But the additional part is that there could be further consolidation in the food manufacturing industry because the pressure is on them continuously from the retailers.
And that is a volume pressure.
That's a volume pressure. It's a volume pressure, a unit pressure, because your margins are so low and you're under pressure in terms of providing food as cheap as possible into the retail market. You are going to face a volume dimension, and therefore enlargement of production operations is going to be a key dimension, I think, in the future.
Kobus, if you look at the future, if you specifically look at your relationship between you, your client, that client and the producer, how do you see that relationship developing?
I think there's definitely a trend, and we can see it happening, is that the client, and Professor Johan is correctly in saying that the client wants to connect to the food producer.
Wants to bridge that gap.
Bridge that gap. They want to know, they actually want to say, I know this person, he's growing my potatoes. I've been on his farm and he's got this beautiful farm. That connection they need there, because people are leaving the rural areas for the urban lights, and inherently us as a human being, we want to be connected to the soil, and they want that back. And within that, there's obviously your ethics, your hygiene, and your conservation of your ecosystems.
Will that also mean that you will need to disclose more information, deeper information on your packaging?
Transparency is going to be one of our big challenges going forward. People is not going to just believe when you say this product is X, Y, and Z. They want to actually see that you can prove it. So definitely yes.
Would I walk into a store in a restaurant and say, I would like to have a certain animal or a certain, let's say, a certain breed fed on a certain kind of grazing? Is that where we're moving towards?
Yeah, we're almost there already. There are many of those claims that are in the market, but even more than that, I want to have a specific farm's beef or lamb or apricots, because I've eaten those apricots before and I know those are the best apricots. But then the retailer needs to tell the customer, you can't have it 12 months of the year. These are seasonal fruits. You must wait for next year. So transparency, education of consumers in terms of availability, seasonality, it's a big thing. You know, in my industry, with the lamb industry, people need to understand that lamb is also seasonal. It's not 12 months of the year. So the seasonality dimension, pricing, availability, quality, transparency, those are the whole suite of things that are going to be part of retail, food retail. And then you must see the new retail stores in Europe. It's you click on the screen at the shelf, and you see the picture of the farm, and you see the quality dimensions, and it's all high tech. Fascinating.
Will I see that in a Woolworths store one day?
That's one of my wishes since I started at Woolworths, that we can tell the client about the producer, so they can nurture the farmer. That'll be great.
Thank you very much. I think that's exciting times. It's interesting. It shows you that the consumer is going to be the determinant of where we move towards. Thank you, gentlemen. Please join the conversation. Visit our website, nationinconversation.co.za, or follow us on Twitter at NationConverse. Until next time, from me, Theo Foster, goodbye.
Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by AFRI, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK, and Sendes.
The world is changing today. The world is changing in every way. Let's stand together, put our hands together, join hands forever. We're making it better.
No matter where you are, you could